Welcome you all. Today we are going to talk about the written and spoken discourse. This topic is from the Contents and Introduction to Linguistics Semester 2. Today we are going to discuss these two types of discourses, which are written and spoken discourse. In our previous lecture, we already have talked about what is discourse and what is discourse analysis. So without a further ado, let's talk about our today's topic. Here is the definition given by Brown and Yule. We use speech largely for the establishment and maintenance of human relationship, or we use it for interactions. So when we talk about spoken discourse, it is usually used for making relations or interactions with people, whereas we use written language for working out and transference of information primarily for the purpose of transaction. However, when we talk about written discourse, it is used for transferring or spreading information from one place to another place or from one source to another source through written structures of language. So this is how Brown and Yule explain about written and spoken discourse. Here are certain differences between written and spoken discourse we are going to discuss. And those areas are number one, grammatical intricacy. Grammatical intricacy, or in other words, we could say grammatical difficulties. Written discourse is complex more structurally. So when we talk about grammatical intricacies or grammatical complexes, we say written discourse is much more complex than the spoken discourse. Number two, that is lexical density, means how much words are used. So when we talk about spoken discourse, is less lexically dense because we usually use less words in our spoken discourse than the written one. Number three, that is nominalization. Nominalization refers to presenting actions and events as nouns rather than verbs. In written discourse, more nouns are used than verbs. So when we talk about the written discourse, we usually use more than verbs, we use nouns. Or we are presenting actions and events as nouns rather than actions or verbs. Number four, that is explicitness. Explicitness, writing is more explicit than speech. It means to say writing discourse is more explicit, is more explained clearly than the speech one. Number five is contextualization. Contextualization, writing is more contextualized. It means to say when we talk about written discourse, it is much more contextualized and to the point. But a speech discourse may be differently contextualized or may be hindered or divided into different talks. Spontaneity. Spoken is more ungrammatical because of its spontaneity. Because we usually speak a lot, we don't know and we don't care about the grammatical structures, or our sentences may be differently or differently structured or ordered. Thus, we could say a spoken discourse is more spontaneous. It is much more ungrammatical. Number seven, that is repetitions, hesitation, and redundancy. Spoken discourse has many pauses and repetitions. It means to say, when we are talking about the written discourse, it is much more written in a very plain and clear manner. But spoken discourse, certainly we repeat the words, we repeat the sentences unintentionally because it is the nature of a spoken discourse. These two types of discourses are actually divided into reciprocal, or we may call it a spoken discourse, and number two, non-reciprocal or written discourse. So when we talk about a reciprocal or a spoken discourse, it is actually two directional. That's why we call it a reciprocal. And when we talk about a non-reciprocal or written discourse, it is single directional. Thus, we may call it non-reciprocal discourse. Reciprocal or spoken discourse, this is an opportunity for interaction. The sender can monitor and adjust to it, or to put it another way, where a receiver can influence the development what is being said. So this is how we are going to define reciprocal or spoken discourse, that it is used for interactions. And usually the sender monitors the messages or the information he sends. When we talk about non-reciprocal or written discourse, sender and receiver may have no opportunity for interaction. So it is a single directional actually. For example, when we talk about reciprocal spoken, it is face-to-face conversation. However, non-reciprocal or written discourse, for example, or for instance, a book by a dead author. So these are certain differences of these two types of discourses. Here are more points which make clear differences between these two types of discourses. Number one, it shares a single context. In written discourse, we maintain coherence, cohesion, clausal relations, and text patterns. However, spoken or oral discourse shares a single context, but it is not that complex process, unlike written discourse. When we talk about written discourse, its impact is persistent, means permanent. Writings cannot be faded as compared to spoken form. However, its impact is transitory, means changeable in a spoken discourse. A spoken can be easily be faded as compared to written form. When we talk about written discourse, writing is static. It remains where it is written. On the other hand, spoken discourse, speech is dynamic. Written discourse, reread anytime, but a spoken discourse, it cannot be reviewed. In written discourse, it seldom needs a quick response, whereas a spoken form requires a rapid response. A spoken discourse, it needs quick response. Written discourse, writings contain discrete, separate symbols. In a spoken discourse, words and sentences structures are less explicit. In written discourse, it uses words and punctuations. In a spoken discourse, it needs face and hands gestures as well as prosodic features of the language. Written discourse is more complex, and spoken discourse is less complex. Written discourse can be referred to any time. When we talk about spoken discourse, spoken has to be understood immediately. Thanks for attention. Thank you very much. Hopefully, this would be very helpful for all of you.